Welcome to Secrets of History, where the past unveils its darkest mysteries. What hidden terror awaits in the shadows of forgotten places? It was supposed to be a routine audit. A forgotten estate, an old house crumbling at the edges of a town that had already stopped remembering it. The Mirrow Estate sat like a relic, silent and sealed, its papers untouched for decades. I was sent in to catalogue, to inventory, to check a box on someone else's to-do list. But almost immediately, something felt off. The air inside the house didn't move. The walls held a kind of cold that didn't come from lack of heat. It felt like the place hadn't exhaled in 100 years. Folders were scattered across the study in no particular order, but one drawer, locked, rusted shut, seemed curiously well preserved. When I pried it open, beneath stacks of brittle correspondence and faded ink, I found a folded packet of parchment wrapped in decaying twine. A seal still intact. The year stamped on the top, 1891. It wasn't part of the estate files. It wasn't even supposed to be in that room. It was a court order. Sealed, signed, and never executed. The language inside was legal, cold, but there was something about it, something frantic buried beneath the formality. Names had been redacted. Entire paragraphs were crossed out with shaking ink. And at the bottom, a single handwritten note, *do not open unless you intend to finish what they started. Whatever this document was meant to hide, someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it stayed buried. Until now. The assignment came across my desk like any other. A cold case file. A defunct property. A name scrawled in tight cursive, Mirrow Estate. There was nothing flashy about it, no red flags, no alerts, just a standard estate audit request. The kind you could complete in a day if the house hadn't caved in or been swallowed by trees. These audits were usually the bureaucratic equivalent of dusting furniture, verify the assets, log the structure, report any anomalies, and walk away. I'd done dozens. I expected creaky stairs, some old tax documents, maybe a faded family portrait or two. There was no reason to think this one would be any different. The estate had been dormant for over a century, and its last legal footprint was barely more than a whisper in some forgotten clerk's ledger. The initial intake made it seem laughably routine. Located in a rural pocket just past the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown land that had long since swallowed the original driveway, the Mirrow Estate had technically belonged to no one for decades. Ownership was in limbo, tied up in missing heirs and dusty probate files. The only reason it had surfaced now was due to a local land development project. The city needed to determine who, if anyone, had rights to the land. That's where I came in. On paper, my job was simple: confirm the property's status and whether any historical assets remained that might complicate transfer of ownership. Nothing about the brief suggested what I'd eventually find. The drive out there was uneventful, but unsettling in its own way. The road narrowed with each mile, the trees pressed closer, and by the time I reached the front gate, half buried beneath vines and rust, I already felt like I was stepping backward in time. The estate itself sat behind a crumbling stone wall, its windows blank, its chimney leaning like a drunk. It looked exactly like what it was, a place the world had forgotten. I had no reason to suspect otherwise. But from the moment I crossed the threshold, something about the house pushed back. Not loudly, just a quiet resistance. Like it didn't want to be disturbed. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, but not from rot, they groaned like a warning. The rooms were too still. The furniture too intact. And for a house supposedly untouched for over 100 years, there were signs someone, or something, had been there more recently. A candle stub that hadn't melted down. A mirror wiped clean. A ledger half open, the ink not yet faded. These were the first hints that the audit wasn't going to be routine. Something was waiting. The moment I stepped inside, the air shifted. Not like the usual musty dampness of an abandoned house, this was colder, heavier, like walking underwater. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was pressed flat, unnatural. No insects. No creaks that didn't come directly from me. It felt as though the house was listening, watching. The dust on the floor was thick in most places, but near the entrance to the study, it thinned. Subtly. Like someone had walked through recently. I told myself it was probably a draft, or maybe an animal. But as I moved deeper into the house, every inch seemed too preserved. Too careful. The Mirrow Estate was supposed to have been sealed off since the early 1900s, left untouched after the last living relative disappeared. But the curtains, though faded, were tied back with crisp, even knots. There were no cobwebs across door frames. The bookshelves in the sitting room had books arranged not in chaos, but alphabetically by author. It wasn't just eerie, it was wrong. Like the house had been waiting for someone to arrive and kept itself orderly in the meantime. In the parlor, an oil painting hung above the fireplace, staring, pristine. The brass clock on the mantel, though its hands were frozen, looked freshly polished. I ran a finger along its surface and came away clean. Nearby, a side table bore a cup of what looked like tea. Cold, dried at the bottom, but not old enough to make sense. That was when the logic began to crack. A cup that wasn't covered in dust. Curtains too perfectly drawn. A grandfather clock that had stopped at 3:17 in every photograph I found in the attic, yet its pendulum looked ready to swing. These weren't relics of a forgotten place. They were markers. Like the house was frozen mid-thought. Upstairs, the nursery told an even stranger story. Toys neatly arranged in a semicircle. A mobile swaying slightly, though the air was dead still. A diary on the nightstand, open to a page dated April 12, 1891, the last recorded day the estate was legally active. The handwriting stopped mid-sentence. He said they would come tonight, and then nothing. The ink trailed off into a long, desperate scratch. Each room had its own silence, its own kind of pause. Like a breath held too long. The house didn't just feel untouched, it felt like someone had touched it, recently, and then vanished. The longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling grew. The estate wasn't empty. It was paused, preserved, staged, and it was hiding something behind the calm. The discovery wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a creaking door, or a sudden chill, or a ghostly whisper through the walls. It was smaller than that. Quieter. It started with a stack of ledgers in the study, most of them typical, filled with neat columns and entries on land value, tenant agreements, tax payments. But beneath the stack, wedged between the bottom of the drawer and a false wooden panel, I found something that shouldn't have been there at all. A cloth bundle, sealed with brittle wax and tied tight with frayed black twine. It was buried deep, as if someone wanted it hidden and forgot it, or hoped it would never be found. The wax had a faint impression, barely visible anymore, but just enough to make out the edges of a seal. A courthouse insignia, partially melted. The fabric wrapping had once been white, now stained yellow and brown, brittle like old lace. It resisted unfolding. Every movement felt like it might tear something beyond repair. But inside, layered in musty parchment, was the document that shifted the entire story, a court order dated March 3, 1891. It bore the signature of a now-defunct judicial authority, someone whose name had vanished from the state's official records decades ago. This wasn't part of the estate inventory. It wasn't even in the same category. It had no docket number I could reference, no legal archive that matched it. And that alone should have raised flags. Court orders don't just disappear. They don't get hidden inside furniture. They don't get sealed in silence for more than a century. Yet here it was, crumbling in my hands, the ink faded but legible enough to understand that someone had tried to erase it. What secret lies within this ancient order? The language was unusually severe, especially for the time. Terms like unfit for possession, property to remain under supervised silence, and generational suppression of records were peppered throughout the text. The wording wasn't legalese, it was cautious. Terrified, almost. And near the bottom, in a less formal scrawl, were instructions written by hand. Do not open without judicial witness. Violations subject to sealing. It wasn't clear what they were referring to, no specific crime, no defendant, no context. Just a sense that this document was meant to be forgotten. Hidden. There were names listed, some crossed out with thick black lines. A date circled several times. A second page missing entirely, torn clean away at the binding. The court order wasn't just hidden, it had been dismantled. Someone had taken care to bury it and ensure it would stay buried. But it didn't. Not anymore. There was something about the ink on the court order that didn't sit right. Not just its age, although it was clearly over a century old, but the way it seemed to tremble across the page, like whoever wrote it couldn't keep their hand steady. Certain words were underlined with pressure, the nib digging into the parchment as if the writer wanted to scream through paper. It didn't read like a typical legal document, it read like a warning barely hidden under formal language. There was a sense of urgency behind the structure, as if the writer had only moments to finish it, like time was running out. What caused this frantic writing? What caught me most wasn't the form itself, it was the absence of what should have been there. Whole sections were left vague. One portion referenced an unspecified incident involving the eldest Mirrow heir, yet no heir was named. The estate itself was mentioned but without context. And then there were the omissions, glaring, violent blank spaces where information had been intentionally removed. It wasn't redacted in the way modern documents are. There were no black bars, no notes indicating confidentiality. Instead, lines had been physically cut from the page. Slices. Thin, deliberate removals where full sentences had once lived. In a few places, faint impressions of old ink remained, backwards letters pressed into the page beneath from the weight of a pen long gone. I could just make out phrases like asterisk, not to be spoken of again asterisk, and asterisk the child was never to return. Asterisk these weren't just legal matters, they were secrets carved into silence. But what unsettled me more was the fact that someone had taken the time to make it look untouched. The order had been refolded perfectly, rewrapped, resealed right down to the cracked wax mark. It hadn't been forgotten in a drawer. It had been deliberately hidden inside the desk structure, behind a false panel that most people would never think to pry open. That desk wasn't original to the house either. It had been added later, sometime in the early 20th century, based on the maker's mark I found underneath. Which meant someone after the court order's original creation took active steps to conceal it further. The question, of course, was why? Why hide a document that seemed so determined to disappear on its own? Why cut away pieces instead of destroying the whole? Why keep it at all, unless it served a purpose, unless it was dangerous, or damning, or both? The Mirrow Estate wasn't just a place someone left behind, it was a vault. A sealed chamber meant to contain something ugly. And someone, more than one someone, had worked very hard to keep that chamber closed. In any proper audit, you expect a paper trail to tell a story: birth certificates, wills, tax records, land deeds. Perhaps even a few personal letters to add color to the margins of a family's past. But the Mirrow Estate was different. It didn't just lack a paper trail, it felt like someone had gone to great lengths to erase one. The court order I found should have been catalogued somewhere in county records, probate files, courthouse archives, but after cross-checking it against every available database and historical record, there was nothing. It didn't exist. No filing. No registry. No trace. Almost as if it had never been drafted at all. I reached out to a contact in the local historical society who specialized in 19th century civil documentation. She confirmed something unsettling. The judge who signed the order had no surviving legal opinions under his name. In fact, there were only 3 references to him in the county's entire archive, none of them attached to a ruling, and all dated before 1889. 2 years before the order was supposedly issued. Not only that, but the ink used on the document, when tested, didn't match the standard composition for legal work of the time. It was a more personal blend, homemade, and only faintly visible under blacklight. That's not just odd, it's unheard of for something intended to be court legitimate. The more I looked into it, the more it seemed like the document was meant to imitate official records rather than be one. Or worse, it was real, but purposefully scrubbed from existence. That opened up an entirely new possibility. If someone with influence, political or familial, wanted something buried deep enough, they wouldn't destroy it. They'd erase the context. Leave just enough behind to prove it once existed, but nowhere near enough to explain it. A shadow without a source. This wasn't just about hidden legal proceedings, it felt like someone had manufactured silence. And whoever had done it had the kind of power you don't get from titles alone. Power from fear. Power from knowing something no one else is supposed to. Even the family records inside the house were unreliable. The family Bible, which typically lists generations, had names blotted out in ink so thick it had bled through several pages. Portraits in the attic were slashed, not broken or discarded, but carefully defaced. Journals stopped mid-thought. Letters burned at the edges. It wasn't neglect. It was intent. Someone wanted the story fragmented. They didn't just bury a document. They buried everything around it, and they buried it deep enough to hope no one would ever find a way to piece it together again. After days of digging through the estate's remains, the sense of deliberate concealment was no longer just a theory, it was everywhere I looked. But nothing struck me more than the room in the cellar, a space I hadn't found on the original blueprints. It wasn't listed in the architectural plans stored in the county office, nor was it mentioned in any of the inspection reports. In fact, the cellar itself had been sealed off behind a false wall in what appeared to be the pantry. No visible latch, no handle, just a warped panel of wood that didn't quite match the grain of the others. I only found it because of a draft coming through the seams and the faintest echo when I tapped on it. What lies beyond this hidden wall? Breaking through took effort, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself not to. It felt like prying into something meant to be left alone. But once the panel gave way, the air that poured out was different. Heavy. Almost metallic. The steps led down into a narrow corridor, low-ceilinged and lined with stone. There was no light, but the walls were surprisingly dry, preserved. At the base was a single room, windowless, square, and disturbingly clean. The dust stopped at the threshold. Inside, everything looked placed, not abandoned. At the center of the room stood a table. Not rotted or broken, but solid, as if it had been cared for. On top of it, a collection of objects that made no immediate sense: an old key, a child's shoe, a rosary with several beads. Missing, and what appeared to be the corner of a burned photograph, melted to the wood. None of these items belonged in a legal archive or estate inventory. They weren't valuable. They weren't sentimental. They were tokens. The kind of objects you leave behind not to remember something, but to contain it. Along the far wall, a wooden cabinet had been built directly into the stone. It was locked, rusted shut, and carved into its surface was a symbol I'd seen once before, barely visible on the back of the court order's last page. Not a crest, not a religious icon, but something older. A shape designed to be understood by few and feared by many. I didn't open the cabinet. I didn't need to. Whatever was inside wasn't meant to be seen. What danger hides behind that ancient symbol? What mattered was its presence. Someone, maybe the Mirrows, maybe someone before them, had constructed this room as a barrier. A vault. And this was no storage space. It was a warning. The house didn't just keep secrets. It kept them locked away in stone, behind symbols, behind silence. And someone had gone to great lengths to make sure they stayed that way. The longer I stayed at the Mirrow Estate, the more I realized that the past hadn't just been buried, it had been actively reshaped. The story of the family, as told by what little remained, felt curated, like a performance meant to mislead. Each clue I uncovered was less a piece of history and more a fragment of a cover-up. Even the portraits that lined the main hallway told conflicting stories. Names had been scratched from their plaques. Dates didn't line up. One painting, of a young man with dark eyes and a rigid posture, hung slightly crooked as if it had been taken down and rehung in haste. Behind it, etched faintly into the wall, was a single line of script in Latin, *quod est sepultum, non resurgat. What is buried should not rise. The phrase struck me not just for its ominous tone, but because I'd seen it before. It had been scribbled in the margins of a burned journal I found in the attic, right next to an entry written in a frenzied hand, *they opened it. God help us, they opened it. It was the same entry that ended abruptly, the last word trailing off into a long scratch across the page. Whatever had been opened wasn't named, but the implication was clear. Something had been kept sealed, and someone had gone against that order. What unleashed this panic? What followed was panic. Silence. Erasure. That's when I began to suspect the court order I'd found wasn't meant to enforce a law, it was meant to protect something, or someone. It was less about legal proceedings and more about containment. The language in it, so vague, so heavy with veiled consequences, started to make a twisted kind of sense. It was never about justice. It was a warning disguised as bureaucracy. A document not to prosecute, but to pacify. And when it was violated, everything went dark. The family records after 1891 were either missing or falsified. Several birth certificates were issued to names that didn't appear in any census. Land transfers were made to shell names with no traceable lineage. Deaths went unrecorded, and in some cases, individuals simply disappeared, first from the family tree, then from history altogether. It was as if the Mirrow line had been erased in slow motion, one name at a time. And the people who did it weren't sloppy, they were meticulous. Every lie was buried under 3 layers of half-truth. Every missing file was replaced with a forged one. Every question I asked led to another silence. The estate had become a tomb for more than bodies. It was a mausoleum of altered memories, scrubbed records, and a legacy no one wanted to claim. As I delved deeper into the estate's tangled history, a pattern emerged, one that suggested the Mirrow family was not only haunted by secrets but was ensnared in a cycle of tragedy that stretched far beyond legal documents and missing records. The family's lineage was marked by a series of inexplicable disasters, all centering around fire. It wasn't just isolated incidents, it was a repeating nightmare. Time and again, the Mirrow estates, properties, and holdings seemed to be consumed by flames, leaving behind nothing but ash and whispers. The local archives, scattered newspaper clippings, and oral histories from the nearby town all pointed to the same grim theme. Every generation was scarred by a devastating blaze. What drives this endless fire? What made it more sinister was how these fires seemed almost purposeful, almost targeted. Unlike common accidental house fires or natural wildfires, the descriptions often included odd details, flames that refused to be doused, rooms engulfed without any clear source of ignition, and smoke that would appear despite no sign of heat. One particular report from 1912 described a fire that started in the middle of a locked room, a room with no chimney, no stove, and no electrical wiring, impossible by all logical measures. Yet the blaze left the estate in ruins, the family's records and belongings turned to charcoal. These fires weren't just destructive, they were erasures. They wiped away history, possessions, and sometimes lives. The survivors were few and spoke little. Those who remained in the surrounding area whispered of a curse, an old family vendetta, or a pact gone wrong. Some claimed the fires were a form of judgment, a punishment for whatever dark secret the Mirrows had hidden. Others told tales of strange lights in the windows before the blaze, or figures seen fleeing the property in the dead of night. But no matter the story, the pattern was undeniable. Fire followed the Mirrows like a shadow, relentless and consuming. This recurring devastation seemed to be more than coincidence. It was as if the estate itself was rejecting its occupants, or perhaps protecting something within by destroying what was outside. The intensity and timing of the fires suggested they were warnings or resets, moments when the past tried to cleanse itself. And each time the ashes settled, the estate's secrets seemed just out of reach, buried deeper beneath the rubble. The fire was not just a force of nature here, it was a message, a violent punctuation to a story that refused to be told. The fires that ravaged the Mirrow estate weren't simply accidents or natural disasters, they were acts shrouded in mystery and suspicion, and they always came at moments of great upheaval within the family. Whenever a new heir was born or a secret threatened to surface, a fire would erupt, reducing everything to ashes. It was almost as if the flames were agents of erasure, systematically wiping away evidence and memories before they could take root. The local community, while outwardly polite, whispered in hushed tones about the estate's cursed nature, recounting tales passed down through generations of fire that seemed almost sentient, flames that moved with purpose, consuming only what needed to vanish. What fuels these living flames? What set these fires apart was the absence of clear cause. Investigators, when they came, found no fault with the wiring, no signs of negligence or sabotage, yet the destruction was total and absolute. In several accounts, witnesses described seeing unnatural colors in the blaze, deep blues and greens that no ordinary fire could produce, further fueling rumors of something otherworldly at work. The town's fire chief once remarked to a colleague that the Mirrow fires were like nothing he'd ever seen, and that they almost seemed alive. As the decades passed, the estate changed hands less through inheritance and more through disappearance. Each time a fire consumed a portion of the property, family members either vanished without explanation or fled into obscurity. Records of their whereabouts were lost, and the town's historical societies hit dead ends when trying to trace their lives post-disaster. It was as if the fire not only destroyed the physical estate but severed the family from the world beyond it, trapping their story in an endless loop of loss. Beyond the physical devastation, the psychological toll was evident. Letters recovered from surviving relatives hinted at growing paranoia and dread. They spoke of a shadow that haunted their bloodline, of dreams filled with smoke and flames, and warnings whispered in the night. Some wrote of strange fires burning in their minds, visions that felt as real as any blaze. The court order from 1891, when seen in this context, began to take on new meaning. It was not just a legal document but a desperate attempt to impose control, to lock away whatever darkness stalked the family and to contain the inferno before it could spread beyond the estate. The intertwining of fire and family, destruction and secrecy, left a legacy as volatile as the flames themselves, one that continued to smolder beneath the surface, threatening to ignite once more with every whispered secret and every shadowed glance. The deeper I dug into the Mirrow estate's history, the clearer it became that the court order from 1891 was not just an isolated document but part of a much larger, more sinister pattern, one that linked the family's misfortunes to something hidden and powerful enough to warrant extreme measures. The secrecy surrounding the estate wasn't just about preserving wealth or status, it was about containing a dark legacy that threatened to unravel everything. The order's language hinted at a legal mechanism designed to suppress not just information but an entire lineage, to ensure that the past remained locked away and silent. It was a judicial safeguard wielded like a weapon, an attempt to stem the tide of disaster that seemed to follow the Mirrows like a curse. The estate itself, with its hidden rooms and sealed documents, acted as a physical fortress against exposure. Each fire, each disappearance, and each erasure of records felt like part of a grim ritual to protect what lay beneath the surface, something so dangerous that even the family was willing to sacrifice their own to keep it contained. The court order, in this light, became less a piece of bureaucratic paperwork and more a symbol of desperate control. It was a last line of defense against chaos, an attempt to enforce silence through law when no other means could hold the darkness at bay. What darkness threatens to break free? What's more unsettling is the realization that this suppression was ongoing. Even in recent years, whispers about the Mirrow estate persist, rumors of descendants who never left, stories of strange lights flickering in the ruins, and unexplained fires that flare without cause. The legal bindings of the past may have faded, but the legacy they tried to contain has not. The court order may be sealed away in archives, but its effects ripple forward through time, touching lives and shaping the present in ways no one fully understands. Those who have tried to uncover the full truth have often met resistance, whether through lost records, veiled threats, or unexplained accidents. It's as if the estate itself resists discovery, guarding its secrets with an unseen force. The court order stands as a testament to the lengths people will go to bury the past, but also as a warning: some histories are dangerous to unearth. The more we try to shine light on the Mirrow legacy, the more shadows deepen, revealing that some stories are meant to remain buried, sealed since 1891, and perhaps forever. As the shadows of this unsolved mystery fade into the past, the secrets of history await you. Subscribe now to Secrets of History, and join us as we unearth more chilling tales from the abyss of time. Hit that bell icon, and let the past whisper its truths to you next time.